Hello again, this is Magnus Mortensen with the TAC Security Podcast, and today we're going to do another video, just kind of pulling the covers back a little bit on what we do in TAC to troubleshoot, simulate problems, and all that kind of fun stuff that makes our jobs very entertaining and hopefully your network's very stable. So one of the things we tend to end up having to do is generate a lot of configurations, generate a lot of strange or anomalous things on firewalls, not from a traffic perspective, but more from a configuration perspective. And one example would be generating a lot of access lists. You know, perhaps we want to try to generate a whole host of ACLs in order to try and fill up memory or do something weird to a firewall, but we try to do that. Now, there's a lot of different ways you can achieve this. Number one, you could try just writing some sort of little script that puts everything in a text file, and then you copy the text file over the console to the box. I mean, there's a lot of different ways you can achieve this. One way I'd like to show you here is using Python and some of the stuff that we were talking about during my last video, which was using curl to access and modify the ASA. In this case, we're going to use Python and a couple of Python libraries in order to connect to the same ASDM handler and do some funky things that are going to allow us to create random access lists as much as we want. So just a little bit of the layout here. On the left, I have a firewall, and on the right, I have a Python interpreter. I'm running Python 3.5.1. Nothing really all surprising there. The actual interface that I'm using is something called PT Python, which is a lovely library written by a friend of the podcast, Mr. Jonathan Slenders. A really great thing. You can Google around for it. PT Python, really nice. So since we're going to be generating some random ACLs and we're going to be connecting to the ASDM handler here, there are two libraries that we're going to use. Number one, import random, and the other one, the requests library, import requests. Okay. So as we kind of walk through this, we can start by just making sure that from Python we can connect to that same ASDM handler and do a thing, create some config, push something. So for those who are familiar with requests library on Python, this will be pretty straightforward. For those who aren't, pay attention. So I'm going to create a variable here. We'll call this my request equals requests.get. And the URL we're going to hit is the one we are interested in, right? This is going to be similar to that URL we were looking at in the last video with curl, where we're going to hit the IP/admin/exec, and then the commands that we wish to issue. So let's take a look at that here. HTTPS 172.18.124.136, that's where my firewall is, /admin/exec, and then config t. You can see line wraps here. Bear with me. We're trying to do big fonts so it's easier to read. And then /access list. Name of the access list, we'll call it test ACL. Permit IP any. Real simple. But let's make sure that it actually sends and ends up on our firewall on the left side of the screen. Okay, so right out of the gate, I get certificate verify failed. On the ASA, I have a self-signed cert. Obviously, that would not validate when it comes to a certificate. So I'm going to add to the end here, verify equals false to turn off that alert. Cool. So we just get a little bit of a bark back from another library, the URL lib library, indicating that there is an insecure request being made. We can mostly ignore that, but let's see what we have on the firewall over here. Show run access list. I don't see that access list listed at all. How come? Well, we never authenticated, so we've got to provide some form of authentication. And we can see the fact that we didn't authenticate by looking at the text that came back. My request.text. Authorization required, yada, 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 blah, blah, blah. So let's do that request again, but now we're going to add auth parameters to it. And if you remember from before, this is just a device in my lab, so it just has some very non-secure passwords associated with it, Cisco. And I'm going to run that command again. We still get the same insecure request warning. But if I look at the text, it's empty. It's empty. We never got, the ASA didn't bark back anything about it. And if I look at the configuration, there it is. So I was able to, using this simple line right here, request.get, The URL, again, is similar to what we did in curl, the IP, admin, exec, config t, and then what command I want to issue. Now, if I want to create a lot of ACLs or a lot of random ACLs, I can do that with a loop. So we're going to do that here in Python as well. Let's pick, something here. We'll do for x in range 0 to 1,000. So we'll do something 1,000 times. Real simple. We could, if we wanted to, make this same request again, but I mean, we're not going to apply the same ACL over and over and over again. So let's create some random variables for things like IP, the source and dest, and the port, source and destination. And we'll do TCP as our protocol of choice, or UDP. Let's switch it up. So we're going to use the random library to do this, and we're going to define some variables here. So we're going to say protocol equals random dot choice, and I want it to pick between UDP and TCP. Okay. So every time that we go through this, the protocol variable will have a random value, either UDP or TCP. Source IP. Well, the source IP, the format for that is going to be some 4 dotted quad here. And we will substitute in there some random IPs, or random octets. Random, my typing will get worse as the day goes by. Random.randint 0 through 255. And I'm going to do a little copy paste here to make life a little bit faster. Cool. So our source IP will look like that. Our destination IP, again, just going to steal a little bit here. Rand int, and again, 0 to 255, yada, yada, yada. Sweet. Okay. And last but not least, we'll add another thing here. The source port, or sport, is going to be random rand int. We'll say from 1 to 65535. Dport, random.randint 1655535. And now we need to create what our ACL line is going to look like. So I'm going to call this the URL. And the URL is going to look a lot like what we have up here. Conf t, then access list, name of the access list, test ACL, permit. We could even have done a random permit or deny if we really felt like it. And now we're interested in the protocol. And it's going to be a host. And %s for the next one. And if I could use other format types here in Python, but we'll just do it the simple way. EQ %s, host, %s, EQ, %s. God, that's a long URL. And we'll substitute those variables that we just created, which are protocol, source IP, source port, destination IP, destination port. And now we will do that same request.get that we did before for that URL. And we're going to set verify again to be false. And our auth credentials based on whatever we were interested in before. Cisco. That should be it. Now when I hit enter, it will do this loop. But before we go down the big path, let's just do 10 loops. All right, looks like it ran. So now if I look at my ACL here, there we go. We now have 10 more lines added to this with a random protocol port and everything else. Show access list test ACL, pipe include elements, 11 elements. Let's go crazy. Let's have it run 10,000 times. Go bananas. All right, 106, 134. So what's nice about this method is each entry that we do, each time that we run that GET request, it's the same as somebody actively going in, testing by running this single command. It's not loading the entire config from Flash. A lot of times this is a good way to test more along the lines of what a actual user would do, running one command at a time or adding more commands bit by bit. And as I continue to run this, you'll see we are creeping up, and eventually, if I just let this go forever, all that pretty memory there will eventually deplete. So I'm going to stop the request here, and again, just walk through what we're doing. We've used a Python loop to pick a random protocol, generate what looks like a random IP address, and I'm sure there are libraries that will do this in shorter lines, and then also generate random source and destination ports, concoct the URL that we would use. Again, this is similar to the URL that we used for the curl video, and then actually make that request using Python, indicating we're going to verify set for false because we use self-signed certs on the ASA that we have in our lab, and the authentication, whatever is appropriate for your environment. And again, we could see that it started to grow the access list here. Show access list. And we'll see that it is essentially just made out of thousands and thousands of random IPs and random numbers. A great way to test config size, a great way to test memory, bugs, all the other kind of things that we do in TAC to try and root out and reproduce some weird things on our firewalls. We use scripts and capabilities like this to do it. All right, well, again, this was us using the ASDM handler to do this. In future videos, we will be using the actual REST API capabilities on the ASA and those later versions of ASA code so that you don't have to go through and concoct a URL, but instead actually use the APIs as they are intended. But like I said in the last one, this is a good poor man's API and a way that we create configs on ASAs for testing purposes. Thanks.